Imagine for a moment that every emotion you experience is a signal, a message from your inner world, quietly guiding your thoughts, choices, and actions. Yet most people move through life reacting to these signals almost unconsciously. A sharp word from a colleague triggers defensiveness. A minor inconvenience sparks frustration. Compliments are met with self-doubt. These reactive patterns are familiar, yet invisible to many. This is the state of the old self, an existence dominated by emotional impulsivity, social missteps, and unexamined reactions. It is not weakness, but untrained awareness. Emotional intelligence, or EI, offers a way out of this cycle. At its core, EI is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions while accurately perceiving and influencing the emotions of others. It is a skill, one that can be cultivated through deliberate practice, reflection, and knowledge. Neuroscience has revealed that our brains are not fixed, they are malleable. The prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function, self-control, and empathy, can be strengthened, just like a muscle, to override knee-jerk reactions from the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. Consider the difference between two people facing criticism. The first, the old self, reacts immediately. Defensiveness, anger, or withdrawal. Emotions dictate behavior before thought has a chance to intervene. The second, the new self, pauses. There is awareness, the recognition of hurt, the acknowledgement of initial irritation, and then a choice. A controlled, thoughtful response emerges. The feedback is received, processed, and even leveraged for growth. The contrast is stark. One is ruled by untrained emotional reflexes. The other moves with intentionality, empathy, and composure. Research shows that individuals with high emotional intelligence experience more fulfilling relationships, higher resilience under stress, and stronger professional outcomes. But EI is not abstract. It is measurable and actionable. Emotional awareness, the first pillar, begins with paying attention to subtle shifts within the body and mind. Tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, or a fleeting irritation in thought patterns are all signals. The old self ignores these signs, allowing them to accumulate into reactive behavior. The new self interprets them as data, providing insight into underlying needs, fears, or desires. This simple shift, viewing emotions as information rather than threats, marks the first step toward mastery. Beyond awareness lies emotional regulation, the second pillar. Regulation is not suppression, it is the capacity to influence your own emotional state intentionally. Neuroscience indicates that repeated practice of regulation, through techniques such as cognitive reframing, controlled breathing, or mental rehearsal, reshapes neural pathways over time. The old automatic responses weaken, and deliberate, conscious responses strengthen. A person once prone to anxiety before social gatherings can, with repeated practice, maintain calm, engage authentically, and influence interactions positively. The contrast is transformative. Reactive chaos gives way to poised clarity. Equally important is social perception, the ability to understand others' emotions and respond empathetically. The old self often misreads cues, assumes intentions, and reacts based on incomplete information. The new self observes body language, tone, in context, interpreting these signals accurately. Empathy is no longer a passive feeling, but an active skill. This capacity reshapes relationships. Conflict becomes manageable. Trust and rapport deepen. Understanding, rather than judgment, guides interactions. Social intelligence emerges naturally when emotional mastery within oneself is established. To understand the depth of this transformation, consider the neuroscience behind empathy mirror neurons, for instance, fire both when we perform an action and when we observe another performing the same action. They create a subtle, unconscious resonance with others' experiences. In the old self, this resonance may trigger reactive judgment or stress, amplifying social anxiety. In the new self, awareness of this mechanism allows regulation. Emotional resonance becomes a tool for connection, not a trigger for impulsivity. What was once a source of confusion transforms into a bridge of understanding. Developing emotional intelligence also reshapes self-perception. The old self often experiences inner conflict, a mismatch between intentions and actions, between self-image and social performance. This gap fuels regret, self-criticism, and emotional volatility. As EI grows, the new self gains alignment. Actions are congruent with intentions. Emotions are recognized and managed. Interactions reflect authentic self-expression rather than reactive patterns. This internal coherence fosters confidence, clarity, and a sense of inner stability. It is this alignment that forms the bedrock for further psychological growth. Importantly, the journey toward emotional intelligence is cumulative. Each instance of awareness, each pause before reaction, each choice to act with empathy strengthens neural networks, creating a feedback loop of emotional growth. The old self experiences life as a series of accidental responses, often leaving a trail of regret or confusion. The new self approaches life as a series of deliberate, informed choices, each building competence and resilience. Contrast here is not abstract. It is lived and tangible, reflected in calmer conversations, stronger boundaries, and more meaningful connections. The benefits extend beyond individual interactions. Emotionally intelligent individuals influence the emotional climate of their environment. In workplaces, families, or social circles, the presence of calm, empathetic, and regulated responses reduces tension, fosters collaboration, and encourages openness. The old self may inadvertently escalate conflicts or misunderstandings, contributing to a cycle of stress and reactive behavior. The new self, through example and deliberate action, sets a tone of thoughtful engagement and measured influence. Social environments become mirrors of inner mastery, reinforcing the transformation. Finally, understanding the neuroscience and psychology behind emotional intelligence demystifies it. EI is not an innate trait reserved for a fortunate few. It is a set of skills, accessible to anyone willing to practice and reflect. The brain's capacity for neuroplasticity allows patterns of reactivity to be reshaped. With consistent effort, reactive emotional loops weaken, while mindful, controlled responses strengthen. Emotional intelligence, therefore, is both the compass and the vehicle for navigating personal growth, social complexity, and inner stability. By the end of this foundational section, listeners begin to recognize the critical role of EI. It is the bridge between reactive existence and intentional living, between superficial connection and deep understanding. The old self, governed by impulsivity and unexamined reactions, is not condemned. It is acknowledged. The new self, equipped with awareness, regulation, and empathy, emerges as a deliberate, emotionally competent individual capable of shaping both internal experience and external relationships. This foundation prepares the listener to move naturally into self-awareness and self-regulation, the next step in the journey toward comprehensive emotional mastery. Chapter 2. Self-awareness, the mirror of the mind. Self-awareness is the cornerstone of emotional mastery. Without it, we wander through life responding to impulses, assumptions, and old habits, often without realizing the true motives behind our actions. Picture the old self, reactive, defensive, entangled in layers of self-doubt. A casual comment triggers insecurity. A minor inconvenience sparks irritation. Thoughts race unexamined, emotions drive behavior, and patterns repeat unnoticed. This is life lived unconsciously, where the mind operates on autopilot and internal narratives dictate perception and action without scrutiny. The new self, however, begins to pause, observe, and reflect, transforming every impulse into an opportunity for insight and deliberate choice. At its essence, self-awareness is the ability to notice your own mental and emotional landscape as it unfolds. It is a kind of mental mirror, reflecting not only the surface of thoughts and feelings, but also the hidden structures beneath, habitual beliefs, recurring fears, and automatic judgments. Neuroscience has shown that the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex play pivotal roles in monitoring internal states and regulating attention. By strengthening these areas through practice, the brain enhances its capacity for reflection, enabling individuals to notice triggers before they spiral into reactive behavior. The old self bypasses this reflection entirely, moving straight from stimulus to reaction. The new self introduces a gap, a conscious pause, between trigger and response, creating space for informed decision-making. Identifying emotional triggers is the first step in this process. Triggers often originate from unresolved experiences, cognitive distortions, or deeply held beliefs. They appear in subtle ways: a tightening in the chest, a fleeting irritation, a surge of defensiveness. The old self reacts instantly, overwhelmed by the emotional charge, often with regret afterward. The new self recognizes these signals as information, asking, "What is this telling me about my needs, my fears, or my values?" This reflective stance transforms emotional reactions from chaotic forces into useful data, empowering choice rather than reflex. Habits of thought are equally critical to observe. The mind constantly generates narratives, stories that interpret events and shape behavior. The old self accepts these narratives as reality. I'm not good enough. They don't respect me. I always fail. These automatic thoughts feed self-doubt and reinforce patterns of emotional reactivity. Self-awareness allows the new self to step outside these narratives, noticing their presence without automatically believing them. Thought becomes something to examine rather than a command to obey. By repeatedly observing and challenging habitual thoughts, listeners begin to reframe their internal dialogue, reducing the power of limiting beliefs and strengthening mental clarity. Reflective exercises enhance this process. Journaling, for example, externalizes thought patterns and emotional responses, making them tangible and analyzable. A simple practice of noting a triggering event, the immediate reaction, and the resulting emotion allows the brain to map cause and effect in real time over time. This builds a heightened sensitivity to patterns that previously went unnoticed. Mindfulness meditation, another powerful tool, trains the mind to notice sensations, emotions, and thoughts without attachment or judgment. The old self experiences these moments as confusing or uncomfortable. The new self observes them with curiosity and calm, developing a sense of clarity and control over internal experience. Understanding internal narratives also deepens empathy for oneself. The old self often judges or punishes itself for emotional reactions, intensifying stress and lowering self-esteem. The new self recognizes that emotional responses are natural signals, and that self-reflection is an act of care rather than criticism. This perspective fosters confidence. Instead of being enslaved by emotional impulses, the listener begins to navigate life with conscious awareness. Self-awareness becomes both a shield against unnecessary suffering and a compass for personal growth. Neuroscience reinforces this transformation. Functional MRI studies show that increased activity in the prefrontal cortex correlates with improved self-monitoring and emotional regulation. Likewise, the insula, a region that processes internal bodily sensations, helps individuals detect subtle emotional shifts, acting as an early warning system for triggers. By practicing reflection, mindfulness, and journaling, listeners actively engage these neural circuits, strengthening the brain's capacity to distinguish between automatic reactions and deliberate responses. The contrast is profound. Where once the old self was hijacked by impulses, the new self functions with reflective clarity and measured judgment. The process of cultivating self-awareness also enhances social perception. By observing one's own internal world, the listener gains insight into how emotions manifest externally and how they might influence interactions. The old self is oblivious, often responding to others defensively or impulsively, misinterpreting cues and escalating conflict. The new self, however, notices patterns of thought and emotional bias, allowing for more accurate interpretation of others' behavior. This internal clarity directly improves relationships, as understanding oneself is the first step toward understanding others. Importantly, Self-awareness is not passive observation. It is an active, ongoing practice. Each moment of noticing, each pause before reacting, strengthens the ability to respond intentionally. Consider the scenario of receiving critical feedback. The old self reacts with defensiveness or self-recrimination, often exacerbating stress. The new self observes the initial emotional spike, labels the feeling, and chooses a constructive course of action, such as asking clarifying questions or reflecting privately before responding. This subtle difference transforms potential conflict into an opportunity for growth, learning, and connection. By consistently engaging in self-reflection, the listener begins to notice the gap between automatic reaction and conscious response. This gap is the locus of personal power. Where the old self is swept along by habitual patterns, the new self steps into agency, choosing how to act, think, and feel. Confidence grows naturally because it is rooted in understanding and control rather than external validation. Emotional clarity increases because the listener can distinguish between transient reactions and deeper needs. Social interactions improve because the listener responds thoughtfully rather than reflexively. In practice, self-awareness also builds resilience. When emotions are observed rather than suppressed or denied, they lose their overwhelming grip. The old self experiences minor setbacks as crises. The new self experiences them as data points, opportunities to adjust and respond. Over time, this ability to notice, label, and reflect reduces reactivity, strengthens decision-making, and promotes emotional equilibrium. Listeners begin to inhabit their own experience fully, without being carried away by every surge of thought or feeling. Ultimately, self-awareness is the mirror in which the old and new selves can be compared. The old self, dominated by knee-jerk reactions, self-doubt, and unconscious patterns, is acknowledged without judgment. The new self, capable of observing thoughts and emotions without being consumed by them, emerges with clarity, calm, and insight. It is this reflective foundation that allows for the deliberate shaping of emotional responses, paving the way for emotional regulation. As we move into the next section, this cultivated self-awareness becomes a critical tool for managing emotions under stress and social pressure. With the mind trained to observe and reflect, the listener will be ready to learn techniques that transform raw emotional energy into controlled, deliberate responses, strengthening both internal resilience and interpersonal effectiveness. Chapter 3. Emotional Regulation. Mastering your inner state. Emotions are powerful. They shape decisions, influence relationships, and dictate the quality of our daily lives. Yet for most individuals, emotions act like an untamed current, pulling the mind in directions that often lead to regret, frustration, or disconnection. Imagine the old self, an outburst of anger over a minor slight, a spiraling panic when overwhelmed, or the silent withdrawal that leaves connections fractured. Reactions feel automatic, as though a switch has been flipped, and reason is secondary to emotional impulse. This is life ruled by the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, reacting without pause. The new self, however, approaches emotion differently, not suppressing it, but observing, understanding, and managing it with intention. The mind becomes a vessel of control, navigating emotional storms with calm and clarity. At the neurological level, emotional regulation is a dance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala detects threats and triggers immediate, primal responses: fight, flight, or freeze. This system evolved to protect us from danger, but in modern life, it often misfires, reacting to social slights, stressful deadlines, or internal fears as if they were life-threatening. The prefrontal cortex, by contrast, is the seat of reasoning, planning, and executive control. It can inhibit impulsive reactions, evaluate context, and choose deliberate responses. Strengthening the prefrontal cortex through practice allows the new self to intervene before the old self's reactive patterns dominate. The gap between these two brain regions is where mastery of emotional regulation takes root. A cornerstone of this mastery is the ability to recognize the onset of intense emotion before it escalates. Subtle physical cues, tightened jaw muscles, shallow breathing, a racing heartbeat, serve as early warning signals. The old self ignores these indicators, allowing emotion to overwhelm thought, producing reactive or avoidant behaviors. The new self interprets them as signals to pause, breathe, and reassess. This conscious observation creates a window of choice to act with deliberation rather than reflex. Simple awareness begins to shift the emotional trajectory, transforming moments of potential chaos into opportunities for intentional action. One of the most effective tools for regulating emotional intensity is controlled breathing. Neuroscience confirms that deliberate deep breaths activate the parasympathetic nervous system, countering the amygdala's threat response and promoting a state of calm alertness. By inhaling slowly, holding, and exhaling with intention, the listener can lower physiological arousal, reduce stress, and create a mental reset. The old self may feel trapped in escalating tension, believing nothing can change the rising panic. The new self, armed with this technique, intervenes preemptively, transforming anxiety or anger into a manageable state, ready for thoughtful response. Cognitive reframing is another essential practice. Often, emotions are amplified by the narratives we create. They ignored me, they must hate me, or I can't handle this, it's too much. These interpretations feed the amygdala and trigger reactive behavior. The old self accepts these narratives as absolute truth, reacting emotionally before reason can intervene. The new self, through reframing, asks, is there another way to interpret this situation? What evidence supports or contradicts my initial thought? This shift transforms perception, reduces emotional hijacking, and fosters a sense of agency. Emotional intensity diminishes, replaced by deliberate consideration and poised response. Mental rehearsal further strengthens regulation by visualizing potential stressors or challenging interactions and practicing calm, deliberate responses in advance. The listener trains neural pathways associated with emotional control. Studies in neuroplasticity reveal that imagining an action activates similar brain regions as performing it. The old self experiences unpredictability, reacting as though each situation is novel and uncontrollable. The new self, however, has pre-experienced potential scenarios, ready to respond with measured thought and emotional balance. Mental rehearsal bridges preparation and execution, reducing impulsivity and cultivating inner confidence. Beyond techniques, emotional regulation also involves recognizing the functional role of emotions. Emotions themselves are neither good nor bad. They are data, signaling needs, values, or potential threats. The old self may feel overwhelmed, attempting to suppress anger, sadness, or fear, believing these states are weaknesses. The new self acknowledges the message, interprets it, and decides on a constructive course. Anger becomes a signal to set boundaries, anxiety a cue to prepare, sadness a prompt for reflection or support. Emotional intelligence transforms raw experience into actionable insight, and regulation ensures that this insight is applied with skill rather than lost to reactive patterns. Stressful interactions often reveal the true strength of regulation. Consider a tense conversation with a colleague or loved one. The old self may respond defensively, raise the voice, or withdraw entirely, escalating conflict. Physiological arousal intensifies, cortisol spikes, and social outcomes suffer. The new self, by contrast, notices the rising tension, engages breath control, and reframes interpretation. This is a perspective, not a personal attack. I can respond calmly and maintain composure. Words are chosen thoughtfully, tone remains even, and presence communicates confidence. The contrast is striking. One approach fuels conflict, The other fosters understanding and influence. Emotional regulation also enhances resilience. Life inevitably presents unexpected challenges, setbacks, and disappointments. The old self experiences these events as overwhelming crises, often magnifying stress and self-doubt. The new self, with practiced regulation, perceives challenges as manageable and temporary, acknowledging discomfort without being consumed. This cultivated stability strengthens problem solving, maintains mental clarity, and allows for sustained effort toward goals. Over time, consistent application of regulation techniques rewires emotional responses, creating a habitual pattern of calm, poised reaction rather than reflexive disruption. Another critical dimension is the regulation of social emotions. Situations that involve embarrassment, judgment, or social tension can trigger intense reactions. The old self may blush, stumble over words, or withdraw entirely. Social anxiety and fear of disapproval dominate behavior. The new self anticipates triggers, notices internal shifts, and applies both physiological and cognitive techniques to maintain presence. This not only improves interactions, but subtly signals to others a sense of calm authority, encouraging trust and cooperation. Emotional regulation becomes a social asset as well as a personal skill. Developing regulation also strengthens the capacity for delayed response. Immediate reactions often come at the expense of long-term outcomes. The old self sacrifices reason for instant expression, damaging relationships or opportunities. The new self leverages the pause, choosing responses aligned with values, goals, and desired outcomes. Emotional energy is no longer wasted on reactive impulses, but directed toward constructive engagement. This strategic use of emotional influence transforms both internal experience and external relationships. It is important to note that mastery of emotional regulation does not imply suppression or avoidance of emotion. Rather, it is the conscious navigation of emotion, recognizing its power without being dominated by it. The old self is hijacked, ruled by intensity and reactive habits. The new self observes, interprets, and directs. By repeatedly practicing breathing, reframing, mental rehearsal, and reflection, listeners cultivate a resilient, poised state, capable of responding thoughtfully under stress, maintaining presence, and influencing outcomes. Ultimately, emotional regulation is the bridge from internal awareness to effective social engagement. The old self, uncontrolled and impulsive, struggles to maintain composure, often resulting in regret or disconnection. The new self harnesses emotional insight, neurological understanding, and deliberate practice to navigate life with calm authority. Stressful moments become opportunities for growth rather than triggers for reactivity. Confidence, clarity, and relational effectiveness flourish as the listener gains mastery over their inner state. As we conclude this section, it is clear that emotional regulation sets the stage for understanding others. Once the listener can navigate personal emotional intensity with skill, they are prepared to perceive and decode the emotions of those around them. Social perception, empathy, and influence become possible only when the internal state is managed. Emotional regulation is the foundation upon which social intelligence is built, guiding the transition from self-mastery to relational mastery. Chapter 4, Social Decoding, Reading People Like a Psychologist. Every interaction carries information beyond words. The tone of a voice, the lift of an eyebrow, a subtle shift in posture, all of these are signals, quietly revealing thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Yet most individuals navigate social spaces unaware of these cues, relying only on surface-level communication. Picture the old self, fumbling in conversation, misreading gestures, responding awkwardly, or missing subtle signs that reveal what others truly think or feel. A smile is dismissed as polite, a pause interpreted as disinterest, or a slight nod unnoticed. Opportunities for connection are lost, and misunderstandings multiply. Social interactions feel uncertain, draining, and often frustrating. The new self, however, develops the ability to read people like a skilled psychologist, noticing the layers of meaning beneath words and body language, and responding with clarity, empathy, and influence. Social decoding begins with attention. Nonverbal communication accounts for a large portion of human interaction, far exceeding the literal meaning of words. Posture, gestures, facial expressions, eye contact, and vocal tonality convey emotion and intention with precision. The old self overlooks these cues, reacting solely to spoken language, which often conveys only a fraction of truth. The new self, attentive and observant, notices patterns, a fleeting frown before a disagreement, crossed arms signaling discomfort, or micro expressions of surprise, contempt, or joy that flash for mere milliseconds. Recognizing these signals allows for accurate interpretation of emotional states and unspoken messages. Micro expressions, in particular, provide a powerful tool for social perception. Research in psychology has shown that these fleeting facial expressions, often lasting less than half a second, reveal suppressed or hidden emotions. The old self is blind to these subtleties, missing crucial information about underlying feelings, intentions, or concerns. The new self, trained to observe carefully, can detect these micro moments and adjust responses accordingly. For example, noticing subtle irritation in a colleague's expression before a meeting allows one to approach the conversation with empathy and strategic framing, diffusing potential conflict and enhancing cooperation. Tone of voice is another key layer. Humans communicate not just through words, but through rhythm, pitch, and emphasis. The old self might hear the words, "I'm fine," and accept them at face value, failing to detect tension or discomfort. The new self notices slight changes in pitch, hesitation, or vocal tightness, interpreting them as cues to inquire gently, offer support, or adjust their own approach. This attentiveness enhances relationships, creating smoother interactions and a sense of attuned understanding that fosters trust. Context is equally critical in decoding social signals. Body language or tone does not exist in isolation. It must be interpreted in relation to the situation, past behaviors, and social dynamics. The old self often misattributes meaning, assuming intent where there is none, or failing to recognize signals due to distraction or preconceptions. The new self combines observation with contextual awareness, building a nuanced understanding of others' emotions and motives. This creates a foundation for empathy, influence, and meaningful connection. Social decoding is not purely analytical. It is also experiential. Consider a networking scenario. The old self might offer generic conversation, miss cues of interest or disinterest, and leave interactions feeling flat or awkward. The new self, attuned to subtle signals, a brief lean forward, eye contact patterns, micro expressions, adjust tone, pacing, and content in real time. As a result, conversations flow naturally, connections deepen, and opportunities arise effortlessly. This skill transforms social interactions from stressful guesswork into confident, fluid engagement. Empathy is a natural byproduct of effective social decoding. By observing and interpreting subtle cues, the new self not only understands what someone is thinking, but also what they are feeling. The old self, caught in reactive confusion, may respond defensively or miss emotional undercurrents, creating distance. The new self responds with insight, validating emotions, asking thoughtful questions, and mirroring subtle social cues, creating rapport and deepening trust. Social perception becomes a form of influence, not manipulation, because understanding others' states allows for meaningful, considerate interaction. The contrast between the old and new selves becomes especially apparent in conflict situations. The old self reacts impulsively to perceived slights, misreads intentions, and escalates tension. Communication breaks down, Relationships strain, and social confidence erodes. The new self, having developed social decoding skills, reads emotional cues accurately, identifies the underlying concerns, and responds strategically. Misunderstandings are addressed calmly, emotions are acknowledged rather than ignored, and resolutions are achieved with clarity. The difference is profound. Reactive confusion gives way to confident insight and measured influence. Practical exercises strengthen this skill. Observational practice in everyday settings, watching interactions in public spaces, noting body language, vocal tone, and emotional congruence, trains the mind to detect subtle signals without judgment. Reflecting on social encounters in journals, noting missed cues or successful interpretations, further reinforces neural pathways for social perception. The old self remains oblivious to these layers of meaning, while the new self learns to read people systematically, improving both accuracy and confidence over time. Social decoding also extends to digital communication. Emojis, punctuation, phrasing, and timing provide cues about emotional state and intent in written interactions. The old self often misinterprets tone in emails or messages, reacting emotionally to perceived slights or coldness. The new self applies the same observational framework, analyzing patterns, context, and subtext, resulting in thoughtful, measured responses that prevent unnecessary conflict and enhance clarity. Emotional intelligence in digital communication is just as crucial as in face-to-face interactions. Developing the skill also nurtures self-confidence. The old self, uncertain about how others feel or what they intend, may overcompensate with anxiety, excessive explanation, or withdrawal. The new self, equipped with accurate social perception, navigates interactions with calm assurance. Confidence arises naturally because the listener understands the social environment, predicts potential challenges, and responds appropriately. The cycle of self-doubt and overreaction gives way to a composed, assured presence. Another essential aspect is adaptability. Human behavior is dynamic. People shift moods, intentions, and reactions moment to moment. The old self reacts rigidly, often caught off guard by sudden changes, perpetuating misinterpretation. The new self observes continuously, updating perception in real time, adjusting tone, expression, and response fluidly. This adaptability strengthens relationships, enhances influence, and builds trust because others sense attentiveness and care. The interplay of observation, interpretation, and response is where social intelligence is forged. The old self acts in isolation, blind to subtle signals, while the new self perceives patterns, anticipates emotional currents, and engages thoughtfully. The contrast is not only cognitive, but emotional. Interactions that once felt tense, confusing, or draining now feel clear, rewarding, and mutually enriching. Confidence, empathy, and influence emerge naturally from accurate perception. Ultimately, social decoding transforms social life from a guessing game into a deliberate, informed practice. The old self, prone to misreading intentions and reacting impulsively, experiences social anxiety, missed opportunities, and relational strain. The new self interprets subtle behavioral cues, understands unspoken emotion, and responds with clarity and empathy. Relationships deepen, conflicts diminish, and trust is established. Accurate social perception becomes a skill that amplifies both personal and interpersonal effectiveness. By the end of this section, listeners understand that mastery of social decoding is not an innate talent, but a cultivated skill. Attention to nonverbal signals, micro-expressions, tone, and context, combined with reflective practice and conscious adjustment, allows the new self to navigate social environments with precision and ease. Once these signals are decoded, the listener is prepared to engage in persuasive, psychologically informed communication, a skill that transforms influence, connection, and personal power. Chapter 5. Persuasive Communication. The psychology of influence. Communication is more than exchanging words. It is the bridge between thought and action, between intention and connection. Yet most people communicate without strategy, relying on instinct rather than insight. Imagine the old self in conversation, ideas scattered, sentences trailing off, points misunderstood, the listener disengaged or dismissive, words are spoken, but they fail to land. Frustration builds, confidence erodes, and opportunities for influence slip away. The new self, by contrast, communicates with purpose, clarity, and psychological awareness. Every word, gesture, and intonation is consciously aligned with intent, creating a resonance that captures attention, fosters understanding, and motivates action. The difference is profound. Reactive speech is replaced by deliberate influence, and ignored voices become commanding presences. Persuasive communication begins with rapport, the invisible thread connecting people. Building rapport requires attunement to the listener's emotional state, subtle mirroring, and demonstration of empathy. Neuroscience explains why mirror neurons in the brain respond to observed actions and emotions, creating unconscious resonance. When the new self subtly aligns posture, tone, or expression with another person, a sense of connection is established without manipulation or coercion. The old self often disregards these signals, appearing distant or disconnected, leaving interactions flat or strained. By observing and reflecting the listener's state, rapport is naturally cultivated, forming the foundation for influence. Beyond rapport, framing messages strategically is essential. People are more receptive when information is presented in ways that align with their values, beliefs, and emotional state. The old self may deliver facts bluntly or argue from a rigid perspective, creating resistance or misunderstanding. The new self considers context, emotions, and cognitive biases, crafting communication that speaks directly to the listener's experience. Framing is not manipulation, it is clarity. It transforms ordinary exchanges into interactions that inspire reflection, engagement, and cooperation. For example, instead of stating, "You need to change this," the new self frames it as, "Here's an approach that could make this process smoother," evoking curiosity and collaboration rather than defensiveness. Nonverbal alignment reinforces verbal messages. Tone of voice, pacing, facial expressions, and hand gestures all communicate meaning beyond words. The old self may speak passionately while signaling uncertainty through crossed arms or fleeting glances. The new self achieves congruence. Gestures support words, tone matches intention, and presence conveys authority and authenticity. Humans instinctively respond to congruent cues. Incongruence breeds doubt and disengagement. By practicing alignment, listeners learn to embody the message they wish to convey, enhancing credibility, trust, and influence. Ethical persuasion also relies on understanding decision-making processes. Behavioral psychology shows that humans are influenced by principles such as reciprocity, consistency, social proof, and scarcity. The old self may unknowingly push too hard or appeal in ways that backfire, eliciting resistance or resentment. The new self integrates these principles consciously, offering value, building trust, and presenting options in a manner that respects autonomy. Influence becomes a collaborative process where the other person feels understood, heard, and motivated rather than coerced. Persuasion rooted in empathy and insight strengthens relationships while achieving desired outcomes. Listening actively is another crucial component. The old self often listens only to respond, formulating the next statement while missing subtle emotional cues or intentions. The new self practices reflective listening, absorbing words, tone, and body language, then responding thoughtfully. Pausing before replying signals attention and respect, enhancing perception of competence and emotional intelligence. Neuroscience shows that active listening activates regions associated with empathy and emotional resonance, reinforcing social bonds. Through these methods, the listener transitions from a passive participant to a deliberate influencer. Mental rehearsal strengthens persuasive skills. Visualizing conversations, anticipating questions or objections, and practicing responses in advance prepares the brain to act with poise and confidence. The old self experiences interactions as unpredictable, reacting defensively or over-explaining. The new self pre-experiences possible scenarios, adjusting tone, words, and body language to optimize clarity and influence. This preparation aligns neural pathways for confident, composed delivery, reducing anxiety and increasing impact. Over time, repeated rehearsal makes skillful, persuasive communication habitual rather than effortful. Confidence in delivery amplifies influence. The old self, unsure of tone, volume, or choice of words, may speak hesitantly, leaving ideas underdeveloped or ignored. The new self speaks with certainty, measured pace, and intentional emphasis, signaling authority without arrogance. Emotional resonance, supported by mirror neuron activity in the listener's brain, ensures that the message is not only understood cognitively, but felt emotionally. Ideas conveyed with both intellectual clarity and emotional attunement create lasting impact and foster trust. The strategic use of storytelling enhances persuasive impact. While this section focuses less on narrative scenarios, it is important to note that even brief examples or metaphors contextualize abstract concepts, making them tangible and memorable. The old self may present information in disconnected facts, which can be mentally processed but emotionally ignored. The new self uses concise, relevant illustrations to highlight meaning, evoke empathy, or clarify reasoning. This approach aligns cognitive understanding with emotional reception, producing engagement and retention. Adapting communication to personality and context further strengthens influence. Introverted listeners may respond to thoughtful, calm delivery, while extroverted individuals may resonate with animated expressive cues. The old self applies a one-size-fits-all approach, risking misunderstanding or disengagement. The new self adjusts tone, tempo, and engagement style based on observed cues, creating a tailored interaction that maximizes receptivity and impact. Accurate social perception, established in previous sections, underpins this adaptive strategy. Persuasive communication also requires self-regulation. Emotional hijacking, such as frustration during disagreement, undermines credibility and diminishes influence. The old self reacts impulsively, escalating tension or alienating others. The new self applies regulation techniques, maintaining composure and responding with deliberate clarity. This combination of self-awareness, emotional control, and strategic communication ensures that influence is effective, consistent, and ethical. Confidence arises naturally when behavior is guided by deliberate choice rather than reactive impulse. Exercise-based practice cements these skills. Listeners can rehearse aligning tone and gestures with words, framing messages for clarity and empathy, and anticipating responses to enhance adaptability. Reflecting afterward, noting what resonated or fell flat, strengthens awareness and promotes continuous improvement. The old self repeats patterns of miscommunication unconsciously. The new self engages in iterative refinement, cultivating mastery over verbal and nonverbal expression. Over time, these practices transform ordinary dialogue into compelling, persuasive interaction. The contrast between the old and new selves is clear. The old self struggles to be heard, often misunderstood or ignored, reacting defensively when challenged. The new self commands attention through presence, alignment, and empathetic understanding. Influence is not coercion, it is a resonance that naturally emerges from skillful, intentional communication. Relationships strengthen, ideas are received as intended, and confidence flourishes. Verbal and nonverbal integration ensures that communication is felt as well as understood. Ultimately, persuasive communication is the bridge between emotional intelligence, social perception, and personal influence. By mastering rapport, alignment, framing, listening, and rehearsal, the listener transitions from a reactive communicator to a deliberate influencer. The skills developed here are foundational. They amplify confidence, deepen connection, and prepare the individual to navigate increasingly complex personal and professional interactions. With communication mastery established, the next layer of transformation emerges: personal confidence. Having learned to convey ideas with clarity, empathy, and impact, the listener is now ready to cultivate inner belief, assertiveness, and the self-assured presence that underpins emotional and social success. Persuasive communication and personal confidence together create a foundation for authentic influence, shaping not only how the world perceives the listener, but how the listener experiences themselves. Chapter 6. Confidence Rewiring. Building unshakable self-belief. Confidence is often perceived as an innate trait, a quality reserved for a fortunate few. Yet psychology and neuroscience reveal a different reality. Confidence is a skill, a neural pattern that can be cultivated, strengthened, and rewired. The old self struggles with hesitation, self-doubt, and internal critique. Small challenges feel insurmountable, opportunities are avoided, and actions are often tentative. Decisions are clouded by fear of failure or judgment. The new self, by contrast, acts decisively, inhabits social and professional spaces with ease, and approaches challenges with resilience. This transformation is not superficial. It is the result of deliberately restructuring thought patterns, neural pathways, and internal narratives to support consistent self-belief. At the core of confidence rewiring is self-perception. Neuroscience shows that the brain continually updates self-representations based on experiences, thoughts, and emotional feedback. The old self's neural pathways reinforce insecurity, repeated negative self-talk, avoidance behaviors, and hyper-awareness of potential criticism strengthen circuits associated with fear and doubt. By introducing intentional cognitive interventions, such as reframing internal narratives, visualizing success, and practicing assertive behaviors, the new self begins to rewire these circuits over time. The brain responds less to fear-driven impulses and more to patterns associated with assured action, creating a self-sustaining loop of confidence. Cognitive reframing is the first tool in this transformation. The old self interprets mistakes as proof of inadequacy, while the new self views them as information, feedback to refine strategy and skill. For example, a presentation that initially provokes anxiety becomes a rehearsal space for mastery. Each error is reframed as learning, each hesitation as an opportunity to strengthen resilience. This shift from self-criticism to constructive evaluation retrains neural pathways, reducing the automatic surge of fear and replacing it with measured engagement. Visualization enhances this rewiring. Imagining successful outcomes in vivid detail activates the same neural circuits as actual experience, a phenomenon known as mental simulation. The old self may resist or dismiss this practice, anchored by skepticism or past failures. The new self, however, consistently rehearses desired behaviors: public speaking, social engagement, or professional negotiation, visualizing poise, clarity, and positive reception. These repeated mental exercises prime the brain, creating familiarity and confidence before real-world enactment. Each visualization strengthens the neural representation of a competent, self-assured self, making confident behavior increasingly automatic. Presence, the ability to inhabit the moment fully, is a cornerstone of rewired confidence. The old self is often preoccupied with imagined judgment, past failures, or hypothetical outcomes, reducing effectiveness and increasing anxiety. The new self practices focused awareness, observing the environment, internal sensations, and the dynamics of interaction without distraction or judgment. Neuroscience indicates that mindfulness and attentional control activate the prefrontal cortex while dampening amygdala overactivity, supporting calm, deliberate action. Presence communicates assurance to others and fosters internal alignment between thought, emotion, and behavior. Behavioral practice consolidates these neural and cognitive changes. The old self may hesitate, avoiding challenges that provoke fear. The new self intentionally engages in incremental steps, speaking up in meetings, initiating conversations, asserting boundaries, or volunteering for visible tasks. Each successful action reinforces the neural representation of competence, creating feedback loops that amplify confidence. Even small victories accumulate, gradually reshaping identity from tentative to empowered. The contrast is striking. Hesitation transforms into decisive action, self-doubt into consistent presence. Real-world application underscores the power of rewiring. Consider someone nervous about networking events. The old self might avoid attending, anticipate rejection, or shrink in social settings. The new self prepares mentally, visualizes positive interactions, and engages deliberately. By noticing body language, modulating tone, and initiating conversations strategically, the new self experiences success, which reinforces confidence for future encounters. Each real-world application validates internalized belief, bridging cognitive practice with lived experience. Language and self-talk are central to this process. The old self frequently engages in phrases such as, "I can't," "I'm not ready," or "I'll fail," which strengthen fear-based neural pathways. The new self replaces these with empowering statements. "I am capable," "I choose to engage," or "I will learn from this experience." Subtle shifts in internal dialogue reorganize thought patterns, creating habitual confidence over time. Repetition, consistency, and conscious awareness are the vehicles for neural rewiring. Mirror neurons also support confidence development. Observing others demonstrate competence, poise, and social ease activate similar circuits in the observer's brain. The old self may envy or compare negatively, reinforcing doubt. The new self observes and internalizes these behaviors as a template for imitation and practice, leveraging social learning to strengthen self-belief. The combination of observation, reflection, and deliberate rehearsal accelerates the formation of confident behaviors. Physical embodiment enhances rewired confidence. Posture, gesture, and facial expression influence both internal states and external perception. The old self may slouch, avoid eye contact, or engage in tentative movements, which reinforces feelings of insecurity. The new self adopts expansive posture, steady gaze, and purposeful gestures. These behaviors not only signal assurance to others, but also feedback into the brain, reinforcing internal belief. This mind-body loop solidifies the new self-image, confident, capable, and present. Risk-taking is a critical aspect of consolidating confidence. The old self avoids discomfort, prioritizing safety over growth, which limits potential and perpetuates insecurity. The new self engages in calculated risks, testing abilities, experimenting with new behaviors, and embracing challenges. Each successful navigation of uncertainty strengthens belief in personal competence. Failure is reframed as information rather than a reflection of worth, maintaining resilience and motivation. Gradually, the listener experiences a self-perpetuating cycle of confidence. Action leads to reinforcement, reinforcement leads to further action. Emotional regulation, covered in previous sections, underpins this process. The ability to manage fear, anxiety, or self-criticism allows the listener to act confidently even under pressure. The old self is often immobilized by internal emotional turbulence, while the new self leverages regulation techniques, breath control, cognitive reframing, and mental rehearsal to maintain composure. The synergy of emotional mastery and rewired confidence ensures that presence and decisiveness are not sporadic but habitual. By the end of this section, listeners have the tools to transform self-perception and behavior. The old self, constrained by hesitation and doubt, is acknowledged without judgment. The new self, fortified through visualization, reframing, behavioral practice, and attentional control, emerges as bold, resilient, and self-assured. Confidence is no longer a fragile state dependent on external validation. It is an internally reinforced neural pattern, ready to guide decisions, interactions, and personal growth. This rewired confidence lays the foundation for advanced mindset strategies. With hesitation replaced by decisive action and self-doubt replaced by empowered presence, the listener is prepared to explore deeper psychological structures that shape belief, resilience, and long-term transformation. Section 7 will build upon this foundation, integrating mindset mastery with emotional, social, and cognitive skills to produce a fully empowered individual. Chapter 7, Mindset Mastery, Reprogramming Beliefs for Success. The way we think shapes the life we experience. Thoughts are not neutral. They frame perception, dictate decisions, and reinforce patterns of behavior. Most individuals operate with a mix of limiting beliefs, fixed assumptions, and scarcity thinking that subtly but powerfully constrains potential. The old self interprets challenges as threats, mistakes as evidence of inadequacy, and opportunities as risky or unattainable. Scarcity dominates perception, leading to hesitation, self-sabotage, and avoidance of growth. The new self, however, cultivates a growth-oriented perspective, seeing obstacles as opportunities, setbacks as feedback, and possibility as abundant rather than finite. This transformation is anchored in the deliberate reprogramming of thought patterns, leveraging neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and behavioral reinforcement. Mindset mastery begins with awareness of cognitive frameworks. Fixed mindsets, as defined by psychologist Carol Dweck, perceive abilities and intelligence as static. Challenges are intimidating, failure is shameful, and effort feels futile. The old self operates under this lens, frequently retreating from growth opportunities and limiting personal achievement. By contrast, the new self internalizes a growth mindset. Intelligence and skill can be developed through deliberate practice, effort, and reflection. Challenges become laboratories for learning, and failure becomes a signal for adaptation rather than judgment. This mental shift recalibrates the brain's response to difficulty, reducing fear-based reactions and fostering resilience. Cognitive biases further shape perception, often without conscious awareness. Confirmation bias, negativity bias, and loss aversion can trap the old self in repetitive patterns of self-limitation. Thoughts like, "I always fail," or "I'm not good enough," are reinforced by selective attention to evidence that confirms these beliefs. The new self recognizes these biases, labeling them as mental habits rather than truths, and actively challenges their influence. By questioning automatic assumptions, listeners learn to replace distorted patterns with accurate, empowering interpretations that support action and confidence. Mental reframing is a cornerstone of this process. The old self interprets a setback as catastrophic, whereas the new self asks, "What can I learn from this? How can this experience expand my skills or insight?" Reframing transforms perception from threat-oriented to opportunity-oriented. Neuroscience shows that repeated cognitive reframing strengthens prefrontal cortex pathways while downregulating amygdala-driven fear responses. Over time, neural circuits become optimized for adaptive thought patterns, making expansive, growth-oriented interpretations habitual rather than effortful. Habit stacking reinforces mindset change. Small, deliberate practices integrated into daily routines accumulate into sustained neural rewiring. The old self may sporadically attempt positive thinking, but revert under stress or discomfort. The new self pairs mindset exercises with routine behaviors, journaling after morning reflection, pairing visualization with exercise, or linking affirmations to transitional moments like commuting. These incremental integrations exploit neuroplasticity, allowing the brain to solidify new associations and establish automatic patterns of expansive thought and adaptive response. Limiting beliefs are often deeply rooted in early experiences and reinforced through repeated failure or social comparison. The old self may internalize messages like, "I'm not capable," or "I don't deserve success," which unconsciously guide behavior towards self-sabotage. Mindset mastery requires identification, analysis, and active restructuring of these beliefs. Techniques such as Socratic questioning, asking, is this belief absolutely true? What evidence contradicts it? How would I behave if I did not hold this belief? Create the cognitive space to replace limitation with empowerment. Over time, repeated practice converts these reframed beliefs into automatic self-reinforcing neural patterns. Visualization and mental rehearsal complement belief restructuring. By vividly imagining success, problem-solving, and adaptive responses to challenges, the listener strengthens neural pathways associated with competence and growth. The old self may avoid such exercises due to skepticism or fear of disappointment. The new self engages in deliberate, detailed mental simulations, activating the same regions involved in actual performance. This prepares the brain to execute desired behaviors confidently and effectively when real-world situations arise. Persistence and adaptability are hallmarks of the new mindset. The old self responds to difficulty with discouragement, giving up prematurely or avoiding risk. The new self perceives effort as informative and obstacles as temporary, adopting strategies to adjust, iterate, and persist toward meaningful goals. Cognitive restructuring ensures that setbacks are interpreted constructively, reinforcing resilience rather than reinforcing fear. Over time, a feedback loop emerges. Adaptive thinking fosters successful action strengthens belief, and reinforced belief further enhances adaptive thought. Gratitude and abundance. Thinking further differentiate old and new mindsets. The old self focuses on scarcity, what is missing, unattainable, or unfair. This narrow lens fuels anxiety, envy, and limitation. The new self cultivates awareness of resources, opportunities, and capabilities, expanding perception and opening space for creativity, collaboration, and strategic action. Neuroscientific research indicates that focusing on abundance activates reward and motivation pathways, enhancing engagement and reducing stress-driven paralysis. The mental shift from scarcity to abundance not only improves emotional state, but strengthens consistent goal-directed behavior. Practical exercises consolidate mindset mastery. Listeners are encouraged to maintain thought journals, documenting limiting beliefs and reframing them into empowering alternatives. Morning affirmations, goal visualization, and reflective questioning further reinforce neural adaptation. The old self may resist consistency, succumbing to habitual negativity or procrastination. The new self embraces disciplined practice, reinforcing pathways that support growth, resilience, and cognitive flexibility. Over weeks and months, these practices become embedded, resulting in long-term transformation. Social reinforcement enhances mindset development. Engaging with individuals who model growth-oriented thought, provide constructive feedback, or share adaptive problem-solving strategies reinforces new beliefs. The old self may isolate or internalize negative comparisons, which perpetuate limitation. The new self selectively interacts with environments that encourage learning, curiosity, and persistence. Mirror neuron systems respond to observed competence and adaptive behavior, further strengthening confidence, motivation, and growth orientation through social modeling. The contrast between old and new selves becomes particularly evident under stress or challenge. Scarcity-focused thinking amplifies fear, hesitation, and self-limiting choices. The new self, armed with reframing, habit stacking, and adaptive interpretation, approaches challenges as opportunities to learn, grow, and demonstrate capability. Emotional and cognitive regulation support persistence, ensuring that setbacks do not derail momentum. This contrast illustrates the transformative power of intentional mindset development, from reactive limitation to proactive growth. Long-term mindset mastery is supported by neuroplasticity. The brain remains capable of forming new connections throughout life. Repeated practice, reflection, and adaptation strengthen networks associated with confidence, resilience, and adaptive thinking, while diminishing the influence of circuits reinforcing limitation, fear, or self-doubt. The old self is neurologically anchored in scarcity and restriction. The new self progressively reshapes these structures, internalizing patterns that naturally produce expansive, goal-oriented thought. By the end of this section, listeners understand that mindset is not a fixed trait, but a continuously trainable system. The old self, trapped in self-sabotage and scarcity thinking, is acknowledged without judgment. The new self emerges as resilient, adaptive, and empowered, capable of interpreting challenges as opportunities and sustaining growth-oriented habits. With mental reframing, cognitive restructuring, habit stacking, and visualization, the listener develops a framework that not only supports success but reinforces confidence, emotional intelligence, and social effectiveness. With a resilient, growth-oriented mindset in place, the listener is prepared to tackle social anxiety and cultivate authentic, effortless interaction. Section 8 will build on this foundation, applying mindset, emotional regulation, and social perception to navigate social environments with ease, authenticity, and confidence. Chapter 8, Social Anxiety. Mastery from Fear to Connection. Social anxiety is more than occasional nervousness. It is a deeply ingrained pattern that shapes thoughts, behaviors, and physiological responses in social contexts. The old self experiences gatherings, conversations, or even casual encounters with dread. Thoughts spiral. What if I say something wrong? Will they judge me? Heart rate rises, muscles tense, and avoidance becomes a default strategy. Social opportunities are missed, relationships are strained, and self-confidence erodes. The new self, by contrast, approaches social engagement with curiosity, presence, and composure. Anxiety is no longer a barrier, but a signal to prepare, regulate, and engage. The transformation is grounded in psychological understanding, neuroscience, and deliberate practice, turning fear-driven behavior into confident social connection. Understanding social anxiety begins with recognizing the brain's fear circuitry. The amygdala detects potential threats, triggering a surge of adrenaline and cortisol. For the old self, a crowded room or unfamiliar conversation activates this system as if encountering a predator, producing physical tension, rapid heartbeat, and shallow breathing, cognitive responses, rumination, self-criticism, and catastrophic prediction amplify the physiological reaction. The new self reframes these sensations. Increased heart rate is recognized as a preparation for engagement rather than a signal of failure. Awareness transforms physical arousal into a manageable resource, allowing deliberate action instead of panic. Cognitive behavioral strategies are essential for reshaping anxious responses. The old self interprets thoughts automatically, assuming worst-case outcomes, and engages in avoidance. The new self practices observation, questioning, and reframing. Thoughts such as, "I will embarrass myself," are replaced with constructive alternatives. "I can handle this interaction. I may learn something new." Recognizing that anxiety is an anticipatory response, not a predictor of disaster, allows the listener to act despite discomfort. Repetition of these strategies gradually weakens fear-based neural pathways, replacing them with patterns of resilience and engagement. Exposure techniques reinforce mastery. Gradual intentional encounters with anxiety-provoking situations create new experiences that challenge avoidance. The old self avoids social events, leaving fear untested and belief systems intact. The new self begins with small steps, initiating conversation with a stranger, contributing to a meeting, or attending a social gathering briefly. Each successful interaction provides evidence that fear is manageable and that social competence is achievable. Over time, The brain learns that these contexts are not threats, reducing amygdala hyperactivation and promoting calm engagement. Physiological regulation underpins these practices. Breath control, progressive muscle relaxation, and grounding techniques reduce cortisol and adrenaline responses, allowing the new self to maintain composure. The old self experiences racing thoughts and tense muscles as uncontrollable, further fueling anxiety. The new self actively modulates physiological responses, creating a feedback loop. Calm body supports calm mind, reinforcing confidence and presence. Over repeated practice, these regulatory techniques become automatic, mitigating fear even in novel social scenarios. Attention to social cues enhances comfort and competence. The old self, hyper-focused on self-perception, misses others' expressions, tone, or body language, increasing misinterpretation and self-consciousness. The new self, building on social decoding skills, shifts focus outward, observing gestures, micro-expressions, and vocal patterns. This attentiveness transforms uncertainty into actionable information, enabling adaptive responses and deepening connection. Anxiety diminishes as the listener gains clarity and agency in social interactions. Mental rehearsal accelerates social mastery. The old self anticipates social situations with catastrophic imagery, magnifying anxiety. The new self visualizes interactions positively, greeting others with warmth, responding thoughtfully, and navigating challenges with composure. Neuroscience demonstrates that these simulations strengthen the same neural circuits engaged in real performance, creating familiarity and reducing stress. Visualization bridges preparation and action, enhancing confidence and reducing the likelihood of avoidance. Self-compassion is critical in this transformation. The old self harshly judges minor missteps, interpreting them as evidence of inadequacy. The new self responds with understanding and perspective. Mistakes are learning opportunities, not reflections of worth. This mindset mitigates shame, a key amplifier of social anxiety, and reinforces resilience. By practicing compassionate reflection, the listener strengthens neural pathways for adaptive self-evaluation, reducing fear-driven withdrawal. Behavioral experiments solidify gains. The listener intentionally tests beliefs about social threat, comparing anticipated outcomes with actual results. For example, expecting rejection when speaking to a group and observing neutral or positive responses challenges prior assumptions. The old self relies on avoidance to confirm fear-based predictions. The new self systematically exposes those beliefs to reality, accumulating evidence of competence and safety. Each successful experiment reinforces the perception that engagement is manageable and rewarding. Contrast between old and new selves is striking in real-world scenarios. The old self avoids gatherings, overthinks responses, and experiences tension as a barrier. Conversations are strained, and social growth stagnates. The new self enters spaces with regulated physiology, attentiveness, and adaptive thinking, participating authentically and confidently. Anxiety may be present but no longer dictates behavior. Social interactions become opportunities for learning, connection, and influence rather than sources of stress. Integration with prior skills enhances effectiveness. Emotional regulation supports composure under anxiety. Social decoding informs adaptive responses, and mindset mastery reframes fear as opportunity. Together, these capabilities allow the new self to navigate social spaces with poise and authenticity. The listener no longer relies on avoidance or reactive behavior, but engages deliberately, enhancing relationships, influence, and personal satisfaction. Long-term mastery involves repetition, reflection, and incremental challenge. Social anxiety is not eliminated entirely, but becomes a manageable signal rather than a controlling force. The old self interprets discomfort as reason to withdraw. The new self recognizes it as a cue to act thoughtfully. Over time, repeated exposure, regulation, and cognitive restructuring create a resilient social presence that is confident, adaptable, and authentic. By the end of this section, listeners understand that social anxiety can be systematically transformed. Avoidance gives way to engagement. Fear-driven behavior yields to composed presence, and nervous anticipation is reframed as readiness. The old self, constrained by avoidance and self-consciousness, is acknowledged, while the new self emerges capable of authentic interaction, attentive listening, and adaptive response. Social confidence becomes a practiced, habitual skill rather than a fragile state dependent on circumstances. With social anxiety addressed and mastery established, the listener is now prepared to explore leadership psychology. Section 9 will extend emotional intelligence, social perception, and confidence into group dynamics, teaching how to influence, inspire, and guide others effectively while maintaining presence and authority. Chapter 9, Leadership Psychology, Inspiring Action and Influence. Leadership is not defined by title or authority, but by the capacity to influence, inspire, and guide others toward meaningful outcomes. The old self struggles in group settings, failing to motivate, connect, or convey vision. Ideas may be overlooked, initiatives stagnate, and group cohesion suffers. Decisions may be reactive or hesitant, leaving others uncertain or disengaged. The new self, however, integrates emotional intelligence, social perception, and confidence to lead effectively. Presence, empathy, and clarity become tools for influence, enabling the listener to guide action, empower others, and model composed, strategic behavior. The contrast is profound. Passive, disconnected leadership transforms into dynamic, resonant influence grounded in psychological understanding. At the core of leadership, psychology is emotional contagion. Neuroscience demonstrates that emotions are highly social. Moods, stress, and enthusiasm propagate through groups via mirror neurons and unconscious mimicry. The old self may remain emotionally reactive or inconsistent, spreading uncertainty or anxiety. The new self regulates internal states, projecting calm, confidence, and focus, which naturally influences others' mood and engagement. This principle shows that effective leadership begins internally. Mastery over one's own emotions establishes a stable platform for guiding others. Motivation is another cornerstone. The old self may issue directives without understanding what drives team members, relying on authority rather than influence. The new self recognizes intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, framing goals in ways that align with individuals' values and aspirations. This is supported by neuroscience. The brain's reward systems respond powerfully to acknowledgement, achievement, and autonomy. By appealing to these drivers, the leader inspires voluntary commitment rather than coerced compliance. Group engagement increases, morale strengthens, and productivity follows. Decision-making under uncertainty distinguishes ineffective leadership from transformative influence. The old self may avoid decisive action, seeking consensus or external validation, which delays outcomes and signals indecision. The new self approaches uncertainty with confidence and strategic thinking, drawing on emotional regulation, social awareness, and cognitive flexibility. Neural research shows that anticipation, mental simulation, and scenario planning enhance prefrontal cortex activity, supporting reasoned choices even under pressure. Confidence in decision-making communicates competence, reinforces trust, and establishes authority without arrogance. Empathy amplifies leadership impact. The old self may struggle to understand the emotional state of colleagues or followers, missing cues of stress, disengagement, or conflict. The new self applies social decoding skills, observing body language, tone, and micro-expressions to gauge emotional climates. Understanding emotional states allows for appropriate intervention, offering support, clarifying objectives, or adjusting expectations. This empathetic engagement strengthens relationships, fosters loyalty, and enhances cooperation, illustrating that influence is not coercive, but relationally grounded. Modeling behavior is a subtle yet powerful form of leadership. The old self may instruct while acting inconsistently, diminishing credibility and engagement. The new self embodies desired behaviors, composure under pressure, ethical decision-making, accountability, and collaborative engagement. Through observation, group members internalize these behaviors, reinforcing norms of excellence and resilience. Neuroscience confirms that mirror neuron activation facilitates this learning. Seeing modeled behavior evokes similar neural responses as performing the action oneself, amplifying cultural and behavioral influence across the group. Communication remains central to leadership. The old self may speak reactively, issuing unclear instructions or delivering feedback inconsistently, causing confusion and disengagement. The new self integrates persuasive communication skills, framing messages clearly, aligning verbal and nonverbal signals, and maintaining attentiveness to feedback. Strategic communication fosters trust, clarifies expectations, and motivates action. Moreover, emotionally intelligent leaders tailor messages to the group's cognitive and emotional state, enhancing reception and collaboration. Conflict resolution illustrates the power of integrated leadership psychology. The old self may avoid conflict, escalate tensions unintentionally, or impose solutions without understanding underlying dynamics. The new self approaches disputes analytically and empathetically, assessing emotional cues, identifying interests, and facilitating dialogue. Emotional regulation allows calm mediation, while social perception guides interventions that honor perspectives and maintain trust. Conflict becomes an opportunity to strengthen cohesion rather than a source of disruption. Feedback is another mechanism for influence. The old self may provide vague, punitive, or inconsistent feedback, which diminishes morale and clarity. The new self delivers constructive, timely, and empathetic guidance, recognizing strengths, addressing gaps, and reinforcing accountability. By calibrating feedback to individual and group needs, the leader promotes growth, engagement, and psychological safety. Neuroscience demonstrates that perceived fairness, recognition, and clarity activate reward pathways, further motivating cooperation and adherence. Strategic vision links leadership to long-term impact. The old self may react to immediate problems without connecting them to overarching goals, leaving teams directionless. The new self communicates a compelling vision, breaking complex objectives into actionable steps while aligning group motivation with purpose. This combination of clarity, empathy, and strategy enables the leader to inspire sustained effort, navigate challenges, and maintain engagement over time. Leadership becomes a dynamic practice rather than a static position. Decision-making, influence, empathy, communication, and modeling converge in authentic leadership presence. The old self, passive and reactive, fails to inspire or guide. The new self operates from a foundation of emotional intelligence, social perception, confidence, and mindset mastery, projecting authority without dominance and inspiring collaboration without coercion. Presence becomes both a signal and a mechanism for influence, reinforcing trust and motivating collective effort. Practical exercises consolidate leadership skills. Listeners are encouraged to observe group dynamics, practice empathetic engagement, experiment with motivational framing, and reflect on personal responses to challenges. Journaling leadership experiences, analyzing successes and missteps, and applying structured feedback loops reinforce neural pathways associated with adaptive influence. Over time, these habits embed leadership behaviors as instinctive patterns rather than effortful strategies. Contrast framing underscores transformation. The old self, disconnected and hesitant, struggles to influence, inspire, or coordinate, leaving potential unrealized. The new self, grounded in emotional regulation, social intelligence, confidence, and mindset mastery, inspires trust, motivates action, and models behavior, creating a ripple effect across social and professional contexts. Leadership is no longer a role or title, but an embodied practice rooted in psychology and presence. By the end of this section, listeners understand that leadership is the natural extension of self-mastery. Emotional intelligence, social decoding, persuasive communication, confidence, and mindset converge to form influence that is empathetic, strategic, and enduring. The old self's limitations in guiding others are transformed into the new self's capacity to inspire action, build cohesion, and create lasting impact. With leadership skills established, the listener is prepared to integrate personal discipline and habit formation, the final layer of personal transformation. Section 10 will consolidate mastery over self, social influence, mindset, and action into sustainable, lifelong behavioral systems. Chapter 10. Self-discipline and habits, sustaining emotional and social growth. Transformation is only as enduring as the systems that sustain it. The old self experiences fleeting progress, bursts of self-awareness, sporadic confidence, occasional effective communication, but inconsistency and distraction ultimately revert behavior to reactive patterns. Emotional hijacks resurface, social missteps recur, and mindset lapses lead to self-doubt. In contrast, the new self integrates discipline, habit, and deliberate reinforcement into daily life. Emotional intelligence, persuasive communication, confident action, social ease, mindset mastery, and leadership behaviors are no longer episodic. They are habitual, reliable, and automatic. Sustained growth requires understanding how behavior, cognition, and reinforcement interact, and implementing practical strategies to embed change. Self-discipline begins with clarity of intention. The old self often acts impulsively or reacts to immediate circumstances, yielding inconsistent results. The new self identifies specific goals: emotional composure, social fluency, confident expression, adaptive mindset, and establishes clear routines to support them. Neuroscience emphasizes that repeated goal-directed behavior strengthens neural pathways, automating responses and reducing reliance on conscious effort. By consciously defining desired outcomes and aligning daily practices, listeners create an internal scaffolding for sustained transformation. Habit formation is central to long-term mastery. The old self may attempt change sporadically, overwhelmed by complexity or discouraged by setbacks. The new self leverages habit stacking, linking new behaviors to existing routines to reduce friction and increase consistency. For instance, journaling emotional reflections after morning coffee, practicing confident posture while walking, or rehearsing social scripts during daily transitions. Each integrated practice reinforces neural patterns supporting emotional regulation, communication, and mindset growth, embedding transformation into the fabric of daily life. Mental rehearsal strengthens habit consolidation. The old self experiences anxiety or uncertainty in real-world scenarios, leaving reactions inconsistent. The new self visualizes desired behaviors, pausing before responding to provocation, initiating conversation with ease, approaching tasks with focus, activating the same neural circuits as actual execution. Repeated simulation primes the brain for automatic, confident responses under pressure. Mental rehearsal bridges intention and action, ensuring that learned skills are enacted reliably even in unpredictable circumstances. Accountability mechanisms amplify self-discipline. The old self may succumb to procrastination, distraction, or excuses, delaying or abandoning growth efforts. The new self establishes external and internal accountability, tracking progress in journals, sharing goals with supportive peers, or scheduling regular reflection sessions. These structures engage reward and executive function circuits in the brain, reinforcing effort and creating feedback loops that sustain motivation. Accountability transforms intention into measurable, actionable behavior, anchoring transformation over time. Time management supports disciplined practice. The old self reacts to external demands, drifting between tasks, often sacrificing skill development or reflection. The new self allocates dedicated time for emotional mastery exercises, communication practice, mindset reflection, and social engagement rehearsal. Structured time creates predictable opportunities for reinforcement, reducing reliance on willpower alone, and embedding consistency as a default mode of operation. The contrast is clear. Reactive living gives way to intentional, proactive behavior. Consistency is the foundation of habit reinforcement. The old self experiences short-lived success, often abandoned after minor setbacks or perceived failure. The new self understands that repeated, deliberate practice, even in small increments, strengthens neural pathways and behavioral patterns. Emotional regulation, persuasive communication, confident action, and mindset flexibility are strengthened incrementally, producing cumulative, compounding effects. This principle ensures that mastery is not an isolated achievement, but a sustainable way of being. Integration of learned principles is critical. The old self compartmentalizes skills, practicing emotional intelligence in one context, confident communication in another, and leadership behaviors in yet another, with little coherence. The new self unites these competencies, recognizing their interdependence. Emotional awareness supports confident action, social perception informs persuasive communication, and mindset mastery enhances resilience in leadership. By practicing in holistic, interconnected ways, skills reinforce each other, producing a coherent and adaptive behavioral system. Adaptive feedback reinforces growth. The old self reacts defensively to critique or missteps, often repeating counterproductive patterns. The new self leverages reflection and feedback loops, evaluating performance, noting successes, identifying areas for improvement, and adjusting strategies accordingly. This iterative process aligns with neuroplasticity principles, strengthening circuits associated with adaptive behavior while weakening patterns linked to reactivity and avoidance. Feedback transforms errors into information rather than judgment, reinforcing resilience and continuous improvement. Environmental structuring supports habit maintenance. The old self may remain in contexts that trigger insecurity, distraction, or social avoidance. The new self intentionally shapes surroundings to promote growth, organizing spaces for focus, engaging with socially and intellectually stimulating peers, and minimizing exposure to negative influences. Environments become catalysts rather than obstacles, enabling automatic reinforcement of desired behaviors and reducing reliance on conscious effort to maintain growth. Emotional self-monitoring is an ongoing practice. The old self reacts unconsciously to stress, criticism, or social ambiguity, often reverting to habitual reactivity. The new self regularly assesses internal states, noticing tension, fear, or impulsivity, and applies regulation techniques proactively. Breath control, cognitive reframing, and deliberate pauses are employed to maintain equilibrium, ensuring that responses remain consistent with the disciplined, intentional self rather than the reactive, habitual old self. Habitual reflection deepens integration. Daily or weekly review of emotional, social, and cognitive experiences allows the new self to consolidate lessons, recognize progress, and reinforce adaptive behavior. Reflection identifies patterns of success and opportunities for refinement, enhancing metacognitive awareness and long-term growth. Over time, reflection becomes an automatic habit, further embedding self-mastery into identity and daily life. Celebrating progress reinforces motivation. The old self may overlook incremental improvement, focusing on deficiencies and maintaining a scarcity mindset. The new self acknowledges achievements, both large and small, reinforcing reward circuits that promote continued effort. Recognition of growth cultivates internal validation, strengthening confidence and sustaining engagement with disciplined practices. Positive reinforcement ensures that change is self-perpetuating rather than dependent solely on external validation. Resilience underpins sustained behavioral transformation. The old self may become discouraged by setbacks, returning to reactive patterns or abandoning effort. The new self anticipates obstacles, integrating mindset strategies, emotional regulation, and adaptive problem solving to maintain progress. Setbacks are reframed as data points, challenges as opportunities, and discomfort as part of the growth process. This proactive approach embeds persistence, ensuring that transformation persists despite the inevitable challenges of life. Integration exercises reinforce lifelong application. Listeners are encouraged to develop personalized routines, combining emotional regulation, mindset practice, communication rehearsal, social engagement, and leadership exercises. For example, a daily morning sequence could include journaling, visualization, breath work, and social rehearsal, while weekly reflections assess alignment with long-term goals. Habit stacking paired with accountability structures ensures that these integrated routines remain consistent and adaptive over time. The contrast between old and new selves is stark. The old self drifts through life, reactive to circumstance, inconsistent in practice, and vulnerable to relapse. Emotional growth is temporary, social skills are fragile, and mindset lapses occur frequently. The new self embodies intentionality, disciplined, reflective, and adaptive. Skills learned across the sections are integrated into daily life, forming a cohesive system of emotional, cognitive, and social mastery. Transformation is no longer episodic, it becomes habitual, resilient, and self-reinforcing. Ultimately, self-discipline and habit formation consolidate all previous lessons. Emotional intelligence is maintained through reflection and regulation. Persuasive communication becomes automatic through practice. Confident action and mindset mastery are reinforced through repetition and accountability. Leadership behaviors are embodied consistently. The listener moves from reactive, inconsistent living to deliberate, intentional self-mastery. Behavioral change becomes a sustainable system rather than a fleeting achievement. The final vision is of lifelong transformation. The old self, constrained by impulsivity, self-doubt, and inconsistency, is acknowledged and honored as a starting point. The new self emerges as resilient, disciplined, and intentional, a person capable of navigating complex social, emotional, and professional landscapes with calm confidence, adaptive intelligence, and enduring personal growth. Through daily practice, reflective evaluation, and consistent application of learned principles, this transformation is maintained over a lifetime. Listeners are encouraged to create a personal blueprint, integrating emotional regulation exercises, mindset reframing, communication rehearsal, social engagement, leadership practice, and reflective journaling into structured routines. By committing to this system, they ensure that the skills developed across the audiobook remain active, adaptive, and self-reinforcing. Emotional mastery, confident communication, social intelligence, and leadership are no longer abstract concepts, but lived experiences embedded into everyday behavior. Self-discipline and habit formation, when consistently applied, transform the cumulative insights of the previous 9 sections into an enduring lifestyle. Emotional reactivity diminishes, confidence becomes automatic, social engagement is authentic, mindset remains growth-oriented, and leadership influence is sustained. The listener is equipped not only to act intentionally in the present, but to evolve continuously, integrating new challenges, relationships, and opportunities into an ever-expanding pattern of personal and social mastery. This final section closes the journey, synthesizing emotional intelligence, self-awareness, emotional regulation, social decoding, persuasive communication, confidence rewiring, mindset mastery, social anxiety transformation, and leadership psychology into a unified framework. The listener emerges empowered, disciplined, and ready to sustain growth indefinitely, embodying the new self across all dimensions of life.